Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, as a Patreon request from the artist in question, I'm talking about the latest album from Punch Cards, the Amy Gibbon LP. Punch Cards is a fairly new, obscure Bandcamp artist who got her start early on last year. I first discovered her trying to promote her album in the comment section of, one of my videos. Now, I should mention this is ordinarily a terrible way to get people's attention, and I really only bothered to check her out because I just so happened to feel kind of charitable that day, and I would highly advise against promoting yourself in this way, as it typically just makes you look really desperate, but I decided to check her out anyway against my better judgment, and I will admit that first album, Espers, pleasantly surprised me. Pretty noisy and edgy release here, very dark and industrial stuff that stretched out for 72 minutes. But despite working with sounds I don't typically enjoy, I found myself actually enjoying pretty much the whole thing. If maybe a bit overstuffed and not doing that great a job of justifying its length. The noisy elements didn't clash with its more melodic tendencies and ended up making a really dark and heavy experience that I could actually kind of get behind. While the melodies have never been the kind that really get stuck in your head, they do consistently do a good job of setting a mood and keeping my attention. I thought it was promising, and she further impressed me with her follow-up a few months later called Indigo Beats, which some people may remember I gave a shout out to in my Best Albums of 2018 video. It took that dark and edgy sound and applied it to a more conventional IDM, ambient techno kind of style, and I found it to be pretty enjoyable too. Even more so this time, since it just so happened to play more to my specific tastes in electronic music and be an interesting change of pace for her. Had a lot of creative moments and took impressive command of its atmosphere, even if the production was still pretty clearly handled by someone working out of their bedroom. It's not something you can easily fix or that I couldn't, or that bothered me in any particular way. But then we got her third album, Part 3, and I wasn't nearly as taken by that one, despite it probably having her best album cover. It kind of rehashed ideas from Indigo Beats and watered them down to sound more like your everyday artificial intelligence era artist. Which I'm not gonna lie, there are way too many obscure Bandcamp artists out there who sound exactly like this. The lack of a well-formed musical identity and tendency towards emulating old styles without much of anything in the way of interesting texture ended up being much less effective at keeping my attention. Aside from a track or two like Clutch and RDJ 2.0 that stuck out to me in some way. Also do not like the title of the latter track, but never mind that. So yeah, up to this point, she'd had two solid albums that were better than I would have expected, and a much less distinctive third album, which kinda let me down. I wasn't super excited by this latest album given the title. I mean, naming her fourth album after her real name is totally a nod to the Richard D. James album. It could be anything else. There's even a track called 4 here. Come on. This was a little worrying to me, honestly, because the world doesn't need more people copy-pasting formulas RDJ started. We got plenty of those as it is. But I guess I didn't really know what to expect otherwise. So what did we get with the Amy Gibbon LP? Okay, it's not a straight RDJ homage, and that's good, but this album was really frustrating for me to listen to. While there isn't really a new unexplored direction on this album, it basically just combines sonic elements of her first two projects. But I think I can actually forgive that, because in many moments it delivers some of her most hard-hitting and impactful material to date. I feel like it aimed to refine the formulas explored previously, and refine them it did. This album is frustrating though, because I feel like this thing had the potential to be easily her best album yet, but is seriously hurt by major pacing issues. I feel a really strong urge to just go into this album and change a bunch of things about it in order to streamline it. I feel like there's an 8 out of 10 album in here if it got some further refinement and cutting down. And I can't imagine the changes needed or out of range for her in any way. In its current form, though, this album is a big mixed bag, with a lot of tracks that all work out of context, but don't always service each other as a greater whole. It doesn't feel like it was brought out to its full potential, and that's what really frustrated me listening to this. I mean, the way this album starts with its first 3 tracks had me really hyped for this thing. This is not like Part 3, where we start out with some kind of middling, low-key, generic IDM thing, and it doesn't get going until like halfway through. On this album, the first thing you hear is loud, blaring police sirens. The first track, Hazard, is completely off-the-chain insanity. loud banging beats, drill-like guitar, feedback-ish synth pads, which he uses in basically every track on here, and some synth melodies on top, as well as various other progressions that only seem to make it build more and more, culminating in an ending that has all this screeching noise, all within a brief 2.5 minutes. That certainly gets your attention, to say the very least. And that hyper-intense, edgy vibe is kept up on Facing Death, still keeping that drill-like pad with some big banging kick drums that sound like the muffled sound of someone kicking a dumpster or something. It stays noisy and raw and visceral and menacing the whole time, but doesn't sound like a clone of the previous track either, just kind of a continuation on where it left off. And then Abstract Nightmares takes a much more melodic and IDM-heavy approach than the first two tracks, but still carrying that same heavy and menacing and intense vibe, going for a little under 5 minutes so that it has more space to meander and change around. These first 3 tracks made for an excellent beginning to this album, and I was really pumped for what was to come afterwards. Unfortunately, then we hit 4. No, it's not a cover of the track from the Richard D. James album, but I can't say I'm all that happy with what we got here. It's this really minimalistic and low-key IDM piece that has a far more lighthearted vibe than everything that came before. Really only this fuzzy pad in the background doing anything to carry over the vibe that came before, and not very successfully. I went from getting all pumped to, oh, we're doing this now. I get the purpose of having a track like that here, basically to let you have a breather in order to let that beginning really sink in, but the placement of this piece creates this awkward tone shift that just totally killed the momentum of what came before. You don't go from all these intense and driving and menacing tracks to great value brand Aegispolis kind of interlude. After that, there's an attempt at easing you back to where we were with Experience Chaos, which I suppose is interesting, but didn't stick out to me outside of feeling like a course correction. And after this, I find myself having much less to say on any given track, because I feel like the vast majority of them are just kind of going for the same vibe, and use the same sound palette. Dark and edgy IDM tracks similar to those you'd find on her debut. These are all cool out of context, but the trouble is having all these tracks that kind of sound the same leads to the vibe kind of getting stale, and tracks that should be more enjoyable lose their impact. This wouldn't be a problem if, for instance, the melodies were really catchy and you could easily tell tracks apart, but like I mentioned before, her melodies tend to be more the kind of thing that works better for mood setting than it does the kind of thing that you get stuck in your head. Are there highlights? Sure. And generally the longer tracks tend to have a bit more focus and stand out a little more in my mind. The track Punch Cards, for instance, started out kind of more creepy and had a lot of interesting evolutions. I realized at one point the melody in the intro was directly copied from the opener from her first album as well. Didn't actually figure that out until I coincidentally happened to hear the two intros in close proximity to each other, but you know, it's a cool reference, I guess. And Manic Depression 2 surprisingly got my attention again, despite having come after so many similar sounding tracks. Seemed to had a bit more oomph to it or something like that, and more, just more substance to it in general. That was definitely one of my favorites. And Beauty and Disorder kind of had more of a drive to it I enjoyed as well, but that one was still pretty clearly muted by its surrounding tracks just sounding the same as it. And yeah, I don't really have much of anything to say about tracks like Starving or Isolation or the title track, because they don't really stand out. They deliver a creepy atmosphere, but they don't deliver anything you couldn't already get out of other tracks on here. Maybe the 808 heavy beats on the former stuck out a little bit, but I mean, it's just 808s. Whatever. Most everything in between the tracks 4 and 21 just kind of blends together in a nondescript blur. Really only 2 tracks left stand out. The actual track 21 does make for a much needed change of pace, even if it's just an interlude. It's mostly got all these chopped up old-timey piano samples that sound like they came out of the 30s or 40s. At least not if for the typical IDM percussion around it. But, you know, it's a cool moment. Very much appreciate it being there. And the closer, God, takes us out on a warmer note, with shifting progressions of piano chords and other various synth accompaniment, and some kind of trap-influenced beat on top. Almost, the final effect is almost like it's a Spunkshine track or something. That was cool. But that's about all I got in terms of individual tracks. I think the main thing that the Amy Gibbon LP needs more than anything is editing. It's got too many tracks that feel redundant and don't add anything of significance, and it hurts my enjoyment of this thing significantly. I could easily cut this album down to 8 tracks, if I'm generous, just the bare essentials. Keep the first 3 tracks, obviously, that's the best part of the album by far. Then I'd say skip from there to all the way to punch cards. I did say I could see the purpose of needing a short breather to let that beginning sink in. The intro of the track Punch Cards could serve that purpose just fine, because it does kind of start out kind of subtle and more slow. Maybe take out the hi-hats in the first minute or so before the first major beat switch up to enhance that purpose. From there, I'd keep Beauty and Disorder, 21, and Manic Depression 2. Got 2 more really well fleshed out and well produced tracks, and the interlude for some flavor and a little moment to breathe. And finally finished with God, although I might also want a beatless version of that track as the ending instead. I feel like the trap-influenced beat that goes over that one also kinda lessens the impact. It's not something necessary to keep it. I think it actually would be more emotionally resonant without the trap beat on top. But even without making the tweaks I recommended to the tracks Punch Cards and God, you keep just those 8 tracks and you already have a far stronger album here that doesn't waste any of your time. That's really the big thing that's keeping me from wanting to fully sign off on this album. The pacing is inconsistent, to say the least. It's padded out where it doesn't need to be, and has some choice moments that really take away from the impact this album could have landed with. If you're gonna have an album this long and focusing this heavily on a certain kind of style, at the very least that style should be something I haven't heard from her before, or step a little more out of her comfort zone. I think that would justify this kind of pacing more, but it doesn't really do that either. It's, like I said, it's just a combination of the sounds from her first 2 albums. And it almost got away with that, too, by delivering some of the best stuff she's ever made in that mold, but, ultimately, I think this album's decent. There's plenty of moments here to recommend it for sure, and it's worth it for those first 3 tracks, if absolutely nothing else. But I can't get past those pacing issues. Before it becomes something I'd want to put in my listening rotation, I'd want to change it in all the ways I mentioned above, and that makes it harder to get really enthusiastic over it, but, you know, I'll give it points for having that potential. Still not bad at all, and I guess I'm overall feeling, let's go with a 6.5 out of 10. But of course, it's just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, the link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.